Chapter 9 of Workers Together. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Workers Together, or An Endless Chain, by Pansy. Chapter 9. Planning. The view which disturbed Dr. Everett was simply that of a young man and woman. He stopped in the street and looked after the two, as, absorbed in each other, they failed to discover his presence, but walked gaily on. Loud-voiced the young lady was, her tones and her laughter indicating an excited state of enjoyment, altogether too marked for the crowded street. It was Hester Mason. There was no mistaking the peculiar tones of voice, even though the colors of her dress had not by this time been stamped on Dr. Everett's memory. The young man who walked so contentedly by her side was Austin Barrows. It was this that jarred Dr. Everett. He had designs on the young man, hoped much for him, was watching him in all earnestness, and laying plans for his advance. But advancement did not lie in that direction. It was impossible to hope for refining influences in connection with Hester Mason. Neither, on the other hand, was it a profitable companionship for her. Hopeful as he might be in regard to Austin Barrows's future, there was altogether too much yet undone to make it safe for Hester Mason to be much in his society. Yet evidently these two did not accord with this decision. They were eminently satisfied with each other, if one might judge by the glimpse of pleasure which their faces showed as they passed. What could be done? There was, in Hester's case, no mother to appeal to say to her, "Your daughter is in danger. The young man with whom she walks the streets is not a wise companion for her." And although Austin Barrows had a mother, it was evident either that she had not much influence over him, or that she did not exert it in the right direction. Mechanically, the doctor had turned and walked in the direction of the two who filled his thoughts. Not that he meant to follow them, he had no definite end in view, but it troubled him yet more to see them disappear within one of the entrances to a public hall. He recalled the fact that he had heard of a dance which was to take place there that evening. Not exactly an improper place was this hall, in the broad sense of the term. Probably 3/4, perhaps more than that proportion, of the young people who would gather there for the evening's amusement were from respectable quarters of the city, and would conduct themselves in a comparatively respectable manner. I use the phrase thoughtfully. There are degrees of respectability. Mrs. Saunders would not for an instant have thought of permitting her Joy to join the company in that hall. Yet, at the same time, it would not have occurred to her as a hopelessly improper thing if the shop girl who occupied a room in her 5th story back had chosen to spend an evening there. But Dr. Everett was sure that the two who tripped up the steps would get no benefit from such a gathering. He walked slowly past the brilliantly lighted hall and pondered. Why should not these two, and hundreds of other twos, seek their pleasures in such ways? The flood of light that streamed from each window was suggestive of warmth and comfort within, and the music which floated softly down to the outside world was gay and winning. What was being done, or a question more to the point just now, what could be done, at least in individual cases, to counteract these influences? It made him think of the Sunset Room again. This room in Mrs. Saunders' house was so called because it was situated that the glow of sunset always lighted it up with strange brilliancy, and because Joy had studied the combinations of colors so skillfully that in that room they repeated and intensified the outside glory. Yet there was not an expensive article in the room. It was small, and the carpet was aglow with bright-colored autumn leaves on a pretty ground. There was an open grate, where always in winter the sort of coal was burning which would bear poking, and shoot up into glorious flames. An old-fashioned lounge, covered with gay cretonne in sunset colors again, having great soft luxurious pillows, 3 of them belonging to it, occupied a cozy niche between the grate and the hall door, while the other corner was literally filled up with a great home-made chair, cushioned, arms and back and sides covered in the same cretonne, and adorned with a delicate, cream-colored tidy, sewed fast. No tales did the chair tell of having once been a barrel so large that it might almost have been called a hogshead. Possibly it had forgotten all those early humiliating experiences when a certain ill-smelling liquid filled it to the brim. Or it may be that the bit of crimson which formed the tidy's edge was a blush of remembrance. Who can tell? Certain of this were all who were acquainted with its depth, that a more comfortable chair or a more home-like corner was not to be found in the city. Other chairs there were, easy most of them, home-made most of them, save a smart little cane-seated rocker which was Joy's special seat, and there were touches of taste and refinement here and there. A peculiar shell from the Pacific coast which a boarder had given to Joy, a spray of real coral from another faraway shore, an engraving or two, hanging in just the right light, a full-length picture of a soldier in uniform, whose eyes Joy had, and a touch of whose expression hovered about her mouth, so that people often said, "Mrs. Saunders, she is very like her father." 100 little prettinesses had from time to time crept into this choice room. Now for the uses of the room. Mrs. Saunders, being called upon to state, would have said that it had no use, save as it was a place where she and Joy hid when they felt like it. Once Joy called it, speaking low to Dr. Everett, a photograph of home, for there were features connected with the large boarding house that the girl disliked, though she did not say so to her mother. Few were the strangers introduced to this room. How did it chance that Dr. Everett, before he had been for a week a member of the family, was installed there, as one who had a sort of right to its home atmosphere? Mrs. Saunders puzzled over it a little herself. She had asked him in one evening, because they were talking about something that interested her much, something that she wanted to hear more of quietly; and his eyes had lighted with such a sense of appreciation, and he had walked over to the easy-chair and seated himself with such a satisfied "Ah!" and a bright "Mrs. Saunders, do you believe a tired man like myself will relinquish this seat again?" that she could not help telling him to come there when he felt tired, and rest. He worked hard, and had little time for resting. After that he had waited for no second invitation, but came to the sunset room whenever he chose, always knocking, it is true, and always, in numberless little ways, recognizing it as a bit of home privacy to which he came only by invitation. Yet he often came. "This is the council chamber where his servants meet to talk over affairs which concern the king," he had said, half laughing, half reverently, one evening, as they turned to leave the room. They had been talking about the boys in Mrs. Saunders's class. She liked the ring of the sentence, and thought of it afterwards, and wondered in what way she could use the room in his service. So she, at last, was prepared to meet the doctor half-way, when he said one evening, having knocked at the door and gained admittance, and found Joy and her mother alone, as he had hoped, and had talked with them but a moment on general questions, "I wish, Mrs. Saunders and Miss Joy, we could make the sunshine in this room reach one heart that, if I am not mistaken, is being caught by false glitter." "What now, doctor?" Mrs. Saunders was not always able to follow his metaphors, but she believed in him thoroughly, and he gave her enough of the practical side of questions to keep her busy. He turned toward her, smiling. "You don't believe in imagery, Mrs. Saunders. Do you know Hester Mason?" "The loud-voiced girl in Miss Mason's class, who comes one Sunday and stays away 3? Yes, I had the curiosity to ask her name. She giggled so much, and whispered, and tried to attract the attention of my boys. I don't believe I know much good about her. I don't fancy the girl." "Yet she is one of those daughters about whom you and I were talking the other night. Her mother went and left her long ago; but who knows what a sore heart she may have carried even to the verge of the grave over the thought of leaving her baby." "What do you want to do for her?" It was Mrs. Saunders' abrupt way of saying that she was vanquished, and he might count on her help in doing what he would. "I may want to do many things, but I do not at present see my way clear to them. I would like to experiment. What effect do you suppose an afternoon spent in this room, in company with Miss Joy, would have on her?" In this room! It gave the mother heart a start to think of Hester Mason received into the home center as her daughter's guest. Did he mean that? Why, how could that be brought about? Precisely what I don't see, unless Miss Joy can cast a spell about her, and weave her into the sunshine here, and hold her bewitched for an hour or two. And what would that accomplish? Mrs. Saunders' tones were brusque. She did not like the plan. The doctor had turned from her as he spoke, and was looking at Joy. He faced round again. "I don't know. That is what I would like to discover. I fancy that she may never have seen the inside of a home, and felt the atmosphere of a mother, and heard the voice of culture talking with her in a social way, and sat down to a small home table where all the daintinesses of refined life could speak to her. What effect might it possibly have, Mrs. Saunders? What are homes for? Why did he give you one? May it not possibly be that he wants you to show the photograph to others for a purpose?" Whether Mrs. Saunders understood the latter part of the sentence or not, Joy did, and her eyes flashed a sympathetic answer. Mrs. Saunders saw it, felt the power of the first half of the sentence, and spoke meekly. "Whatever you and Joy want to do, I'm willing, though I don't pretend to understand half that you are after. The room is none too good to use in any way that seems to you to be for anybody's help. What is he after, Joy? Can you make it out?" Joy laughed, a low, sweet laugh. "Copying photographs, Mother," she said, her eyes brimming with mischief. Then she grew suddenly grave. "I don't think I understand, Doctor, any better than Mother does. I would like to help the girl, her face haunts me; and I would like her to know Mother, and see our little piece of home, if that would do her any good. But how could it be brought about? Could I invite her? Why, of course I could, to come and see me? But would she come, do you think? And if she did, what could I do to make her feel comfortable, and interest her?" "That last," said the doctor, smiling gravely, "is a question that may be difficult to answer. It may be necessary to experiment a little before we shall know how to answer it. As to her coming, I think she would. She would be very much astonished, doubtless, over the invitation. But as for shrinking, with a sense of incongruity, or with a sensitive feeling of any sort, I fancy that is foreign to her nature. She would be comfortable, too, in a sense; that is, I mean, at her ease. But whether there is that in her which would really be entertained by you and by your surroundings remains to be seen. Let us hope and pray that there is. You see, Miss Joy, it is true as I said. From the glimpses which I have had of her aunt's face, I feel sure she has no home. And what can a girl do without a home, and a mother?" "I don't know." Joy said it simply, but with intense gravity, as one to whom the sense of loss which that word "without" conveyed was beyond expression. Dr. Everett's next sentence shadowed her face and cleared her mother's. "One feature of the plan I would like to see tried involves an attempt to bring her into closer acquaintance with her Sabbath school teacher. If Miss Mason is going to do anything for her on Sabbath, she should become acquainted with her week day character. I have thought about it earnestly this evening. Her home will not do. It is too set apart and stately; too far removed from any idea of home; that is, I mean, the room in which she receives her friends. It is simply a parlor after the approved sort. It would not say anything but money to a girl like Hester Mason. And then her teacher would not know what in the world to do with her. In fact, I have very little idea that she would consent to try the experiment of inviting her, except perhaps in a patronizing way, as one of the lower classes, which is not what I mean at all. But I have thought that if she could meet the girl here, with you and your mother to bridge over the gulf that separates them, by being always able to remember that both ought to belong to Christ, and become sisters in him, perhaps much might be accomplished. Could you manage to bring about such a strange order of events, do you think?" Then spoke Mrs. Saunders briskly. She began to get a glimpse of the doctor's meaning. He was not filling his mind with a wild notion that that Mason girl was on an equality with her Joy, and must be invited and visited with as an equal. He was simply anxious to bring teacher and pupil together, that they might learn more of each other, and he felt the necessity of using Joy's tact and quick-wittedness to bring it about. "That's easily managed," she said. "Joy can ask Miss Mason here to meet the girl, and help them to get acquainted. Of course she can. I'll risk Joy at managing such things. And they can have tea in here. I'll get the poor girl a good supper for once in her life. It's a nice plan, Doctor, now that I understand it. I wonder I've never thought to do some such thing." But Joy was silent, her face grave and a trifle perplexed. After Dr. Everett went away, being called by the ringing of his night bell, before he was ready to go, she brought some of the shadow into life, and laid it before her mother. "Dr. Everett is always finding hard things for me to do." "Hard things, child! I think he keeps the hard things for himself, and gives you the pleasant ones. I'm sure he has a hard enough time of it. Here he has been running around since before daylight, and now he must go off again. And it is an ugly dark night, and half rains, half snows, the meanest kind of a night. I don't like half-way doings with the weather, nor anything else. I'd rather it would downright storm any time than mince at it. What is there hard about inviting that poor thing to supper? I should think you would like it." "It isn't the poor thing, Mother, it is the rich one. I wish you hadn't helped him along. How can I invite Miss Mason here to take tea with me?" "And why can't you, pray? I'll warrant you can give her as good a tea as she can get at home. I'll make some of my cream muffins for her, and scallop some oysters in a way that no hired help ever thought of doing. She'll like it, you may depend." "Oh, Mother, it isn't the muffins nor the oysters." Joy looked half vexed, though she laughed. "Don't you know she has never called on me, and has no idea of doing so? Think of my going around there, and inviting her to come and take tea! It will look just as though I was creeping after her, and coaxing myself into her circle. And I don't belong to it, and don't want to." "Well, as to that, child, you are Joy Saunders, the daughter of James L. Saunders, a brave soldier, and the granddaughter of Adoniram Saunders, and belong to your own circle, without any particular need of creeping after any other. It would be hard to find better blood than yours, and money counts very little with real folks, you'll find." "I wouldn't exchange my grandfather for all the Masons of 3 generations together. You know that, Mother. But I don't like to appear to creep after people who have money, and live in grand houses, especially people who do not notice me." "Oh, well," said Mrs. Saunders soothingly, "there isn't the least danger of anybody thinking any such thing. You can tell Miss Mason that it is the doctor's plan for giving her a chance to get acquainted with the girl, without giving her any trouble about it. And she needn't come unless she likes, of course. You don't invite her to visit you. It's just lending the room and the supper as a kind of accommodation. As to that, child, suppose she does think you are creeping. Can't you take the name of creeping, if the king wants you to? If you are his servant, you needn't be above his work. It is no more than they said of him. There isn't a mean, low motive that you can think of, but what some of the Pharisees hinted that it was the object for which he was working. I guess you can stand it, if he could." Did she know her daughter so well, that she brought forth this unanswerable argument at the last? Not a word of her soothing explanation as to the object for inviting Miss Mason did Joy accept. But this last was from another standpoint. If it was really and truly work for him, she was willing even to creep. Yet she told herself as she went up to her room that it was a very hard thing for her to do, to invite Miss Mason to take tea with her in the sunset room. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Trisha G.